Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We'll be learning today Mirat Hashem Daf Tzadik Amid Aleph, and I hope that we'll get to a little bit of Tzadik Amid Beis as well. Let's see, that's being a little bit optimistic, but let's be an optimist. Let's see what happens. In any case, we're continuing to learn Hilchas Sukkah, and we pick up today near the bottom of Peites Amid Beis, 4 lines off the bottom of Peites Amid Beis, in Siman Taf Reish Chav Tes Sif Yud Aleph. And we are continuing to learn the halachas of schach, what's usable as schach, what's kosher for schach, and what is pasul for schach. Says the Mechaber in Sif Yud Aleph, Mesachechin befinoigoi. You can use fennel. That's what this finoigoi is. It's fennel. You could use fennel hanikra ba'arvi shumar, which in Aramaic is called shumar. V'hu ma'achel behema, and this is animal fodder. Ve'ein b'nei adam oichlam oisai elo l'refua. People only consume this for refuah purposes. Now, we learned earlier in Sif Tes that you're not allowed to use foodstuffs. Anything that humans eat, you cannot use as schach, and that's because oichlin amakabel tuma. And let's remember, one of the primary requirements for something to be kosher for schach is it has to not be royal l'kabel tuma. It can't be something that can become tamei, and food can become tamei. But that's only a Michael Adam. Only a Michael Adam is royal l'kabel tuma. Michael Behema is not royal l'kabel tuma. This fennel that we're speaking about here in Sif Yud Aleph is a Michael Behema. People consume it for refuah. So one thing we see from this Sif Yud Aleph over here is that the Mechaber is telling us when people eat something for refuah purposes, that does not give it the status of a food, therefore it's not royal l'kabel tuma, and therefore it's usable as schach. Now let's go on to Sif Yud Beis. Very interesting Sif here. So before I read Sif Yud Beis to you, there are 2 concepts that you have to know for Sif Yud Beis. One concept is, there's a very basic difference, and we've come across this already several times since we started learning Hilchas Sukkah. There's a basic difference between schach pasul and empty space in the schach. Schach pasul pasels a sukkah when you have 4 tfachim of pasul a schach. Avir, empty space, could pasul a sukkah when you only have 3 tfachim of empty space. Now, the classic example to illustrate this is when we talk about a sukkah that only has 3 walls. If you have a 3-wall sukkah, and in the middle of the schach, if you would have, let's say, a gap in the schach that's in the center of the sukkah, running perpendicular to the middle wall of the sukkah, so that that gap in the schach breaks the sukkah in half. If you have an airspace in the schach of 3 tfachim or more, remember, 3 tfachim is the shear of limud. So, if you have schach, but you have a gap in the center of the schach that's 3 tfachim or greater, essentially it breaks the continuity of the schach, and it breaks the entire sukkah in half. Now, if you have a 3-wall sukkah, a sukkah like this, and you have that gap running down the center, so that now it breaks the sukkah in half, now you have 2 2-wall sukkahs. You don't have 1 3-wall sukkah, you have 2 2-wall sukkahs. And now this sukkah is going to be pasul. That's the halachah of empty airspace. Empty airspace is a problem when it's 3 tfachim or greater. That's not the halachah by schach pasul. Schach pasul, if you would have the same exact example, you would have that 3-wall sukkah, and let's say running down the center of the sukkah, again perpendicular to the 3rd wall, in this case the back wall of the sukkah, running perpendicular to that, you would have a strip of pasul schach. In order for it to break the sukkah in half, you would have to have a strip that's 4 tfachim or greater. So in this sense, empty space is more chamor than schach pasul. Empty space becomes a problem already at 3 tfachim. Schach pasul becomes a problem at 4 tfachim. Now the Mechaber over here in Sif Yud Beis is going to discuss an interesting case. He's going to discuss an interesting case where you have schach that gives you both problems. We're going to have schach that is going to be considered empty space, and it's also schach pasul. And therefore, the Mechaber wants to make the following point. This pasul schach that you're putting on top of the sukkah, which also is going to have the din of avir, does it pasul by 3 tvachim, or does it pasul by 4 tvachim? Do we give it the din of schach pasul and say it's a problem if you have 4 tvachim? Or since halachically we're also going to treat it as avir, we're going to treat it as empty space, maybe it becomes a problem at 3 tvachim. Now let's take a look inside. Let's see the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber here in Sif Yud Beis. Sichech biyarokos shemimaharin liyavesh. Let's say you used some kind of a vegetable, and it's a vegetable that has stalks and leaves. In my mind, I'm imagining, let's say, a bunch of fresh carrots. You know, you go to the supermarket, you want to make a nice chicken soup for Shabbos, and you buy a bunch of fresh carrots. The carrots are this long. And then you have attached to the end of the carrots, you have the long greens, the stalks and the leaves of the carrots. You bring it home and a little kid looks at it and he sees you lop off the greens and throw the greens in the garbage and keep the carrots and use the carrots. It looks like you're throwing out 80% of what you purchased, right? Because those leaves and stalks are sometimes very long. Now carrots are royal achila. It's a Michael Adam. Since it's a Michael Adam, it's Makabel Tumah. Since it's Makabel Tumah, it's pasul schach. So, if you wanted to take bunches of carrots together with their leaves and their stalks, and you wanted to throw it up on top of your sukkah, and you wanted to use it as schach, you're putting schach pasul on top of your sukkah, because it's royal Makabel Tumah. Now, let's imagine that you had one of these 3-wall sukkahs, and you put a strip that was 4 tvachim wide of these carrots with their leaves and with their stalks on top of the sukkah. So, if it's 4 tvachim wide, it's schach pasul, that's 4 tvachim wide, that's a problem. Let's say it's less than 4 tvachim wide. Let's say it's 3 tvachim wide. Well, schach pasul at 3 tvachim is not a problem. But now the Mechaber is going to introduce another potential problem that you have with these vegetables and stalks and leaves. Sichech biyarokos shemimaharin liyavesh. Let's say you put these vegetables with their stalks and leaves on top of the sukkah, and you live in a very hot and maybe dry climate. And because it's very hot and dry, what happens is, very soon after you put these vegetables up on top of the sukkah, the stalks and the leaves dry out. And when they dry out, they break apart and they fall. So you thought you were putting up a great covering of schach. You put up the carrots with their stalks and their leaves. Now, first of all, you blew it, because the carrots are royal Makabel Tumah and the pasul schach. But there's another problem as well. And that problem is that the stalks and the leaves are going to dry out. And when they dry out and they crumble and they fall, you're going to be left with empty space. Now, the halachah is, when you put something up on top of the sukkah, which is not going to last for 7 days, it's going to crumble and break up during sukkahs, we look at it even at the start as if it's empty space, as if it's avir. So now, with that halachic concept in mind, we have a dual problem with these carrots and their stalks and leaves. One problem is that the carrots are royal Makabel Tumah. Since they're royal Makabel Tumah, they're schach pasul. There's a second problem, which is that the stalks and the leaves are going to dry out, and they're going to crumble, and they're going to fall off. Since that's the case, we look at it as avir. We look at it as empty space. Now, wonders the Mechaber, how do we look at this strip of schach that you put down the center of the sukkah? Do we say it's schach pasul because it's royal Makabel Tumah? Oh, if it's schach pasul, I have up to 4 tvachim. Or do we say, wait a second, since it's going to dry out and crumble and fall apart, it's avir, it's empty space. And avir pasuls in 3 tvachim. So even if it's only a strip of 3 tvachim, it already invalidates the sukkah. That's the case that the Mechaber is addressing over here. And let's see what he says. If you put up as schach vegetables that are edible, so they're royal Makabel Tumah and they're pasul, and you did this in a place where they're going to dry out very rapidly. Says the Mechaber, even though you might be tempted to just give this the din of pasul schach, because it's royal kabel tuma and it is pasul schach, ein dinam kischach pasul lifsail ba'arba tvachim. We don't give it the din of pasul schach and say that it only becomes problematic at 4 tvachim. Elo ka'avir chashive. Rather, we treat it like empty space, lifsail b'shloisha, and it will pasul the sukkah already at 3 tvachim. V'im ein darkom liyavesh. But if you don't live in a hot, dry climate, and the fact is that it will stay intact over sukkahs, then dinam kischach pasul, then we treat it like schach pasul because it's royal kabel tuma upaislim ba'arba tvachim, and then it only becomes problematic at 4 tvachim. Now, the wording of the Mechaber here was afal pi shepsulim l'sakech, even though it's pasul for schach mipnei shebekablim tuma, still ein dinam kischach pasul lifsa ba'arba tvachim el kavir chashiv lifsa b'shloisha. The even over here is, what the Mechaber is telling you is, you might have thought that since this is schach pasul, and it always was schach pasul, there was never a chance for this schach to be kosher as schach. It's carrots, it's royal kabel tuma. So maybe, once this is already pasul as schach pasul, maybe we don't apply this halachah, that since it's going to dry out, we treat it as avir. We would use that halachah by schach kosher. If you put up something that essentially is schach kosher, the problem is that it's going to shrivel up, dry up, and fall apart. Then we apply the halacha that we treat it like avir, because it's going to shrivel and dry up, because that's the only problem that this schach has. But in the case of the carrots, where from the outset it's already pasul schach, then maybe we just give it the din of pasul schach, and we don't apply the halacha to treat it like avir. The Mechaber is telling me that no, even though from the outset it's already pasul schach, we still do apply this halacha, we treat it like avir, and therefore it's going to become problematic already at 3 tvachim. And we can see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go to the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Lamed Beis. Sichech bi'arakos. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say over here is, if you're doing this in a locale where it's very hot and dry, so that it's going to quickly shrivel up and dry up and fall apart during the 7 days of Yom Tov, and when it does dry up, the leaves and the stalks are going to fall off, v'yisha'er avir, and you're going to be left with empty space. Because here in this sif, when we talk about yerakos, we're talking about yerakos that are edible. So they're royal kabel tuma, ubsulim l'sakech behem. So they're in their very essence, they're pasul schach. V'hava amina, and I would have thought the bishvil said that because of this, since from the outset this is pasul schach because it's an oichel and it's royal kabel tuma, ein chalalem shem psul acher. Maybe we will not apply a secondary psul. We already have a psul from the outset. It's royal kabel tuma. So maybe now we don't apply a secondary psul of this halacha that we treat it like avir. So the Mechaber is coming to teach us that no, we don't use that logic, and we do say that it's considered avir. Schach pasul will pasul a 3-wall sukkah with a strip down the center if it's 4 tvachim. Kemavor b'siman tafreish lamed beis. The schach pasul pasul be'emtza ba'arba tvachim. Schach pasul will break a sukkah in half and pasul it because it will render each side to be a 2-wall sukkah if you only have a strip of 4 tvachim. Va'avir, but empty space in the same situation. Pasul bein be'emtza bein minatzad b'shloisha tvachim. Empty space is more chomer than schach pasul. Empty space already becomes a problem at 3 tvachim because that's already more than the sheer limud. It breaks the continuity of the schach, and it will pasul a sukkah with a strip down the center or with a strip along the side. If you have a strip between the top of the wall and the beginning of the schach that's greater than 3 tvachim, that's going to pasul the sukkah empty space, because you can't say limud. If there would be schach pasul along the perimeter of the sukkah, between the top of the wall and the beginning of the schach, it wouldn't be pasul. You would say doifan akuma. You would look at the wall as if it's bent. But by empty space, you can't say doifan akuma. There's nothing there. So you have to say limud. Once it's more than 3 tvachim, you can't say limud. So a strip of empty airspace 3 tvachim or greater will pasul a sukkah both on the side by the perimeter or at the center. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakal ni b'dvar. Okay. Ice cotton lamed hay. So, since the stalks and the leaves are going to shrivel up and fall, we don't treat this as pasul schach to say it becomes problematic at 4 tvachim. Instead, ice cotton lamed hay, ela ka'avir chashivi, we view it as empty airspace. Hainu afilu kaidem shenis yavshu, and we treat it as empty airspace even before it shrivels up and dries out. Why? Mishum dekevan dekasher nisyavshu. Since when it ultimately does dry out, mispyrerice, it's going to crumble, v'noiflice, and it's going to fall apart, ve'ein sukkah ru'uya lehiskayim l'shiva yomim, so that this sukkah with this type of schach is not royal l'shiva. Pasuk says, Chag HaSukkah is tasalach shiva yomim. You need 7 days. You need a 7-day sukkah. This sukkah is not ru'uya l'shiva, because the schach is going to dry out. Gozer rabbanon mehashta. So the chachamim were gozer that if you put up a type of schach which is going to shrivel up, dry out, and fall apart during the 7 days, it's already pasul from the outset, even when it's intact, and it is providing tzilasa meruba mechamasa. It doesn't matter. It's already pasul. The kasra paiskim, the paiskim, right? This halachah that we just described, it pertains even if you're not using carrots, even if you're using some kind of stalks that are perfectly kosher l'schach, just they're going to shrivel up and dry out during the 7 days. They're also pasul already from the outset. The chiddush of the mechaber over here was in the case where it's royal l'kabel tumah and it's pasul l'schach, you might think that this halachah doesn't apply. But if it was kosher schach, it certainly applies. Now let's just go to the top line of Tzadik Amud Aleph to the Ramah, which essentially makes the point that the Mishnah Berurah just said. Again, I just want to be clear. The Mechaber gave us a case where the Yerakos that we're using are royal la'achila. And since they're royal la'achila, they're royal l'kabel tumah, and they're pasul l'schach. The chiddush of the Mechaber is, even though from the outset they're pasul l'schach, and as pasul l'schach they pasul l'sukkah by 4 tvachim, there's a chiddush that we also apply the secondary pasul, that we look at it as avir, and it will pasul the sukkah by 3 tvachim. But let's say we're talking about vegetables that are not royal achilas adam. Let's say we're talking about some kind of stalks that are perfectly kosher schach. The only problem that they have is that they're going to dry out, shrivel up, and fall apart toich shiva. And therefore the halacha is that we treat it like avir, and it passes the sukkah, a strip of 3 tvachim or greater. Says the Ramah, Hagah, the choma shedarka liyavesh toich shiva. This halacha applies to anything that's going to dry up and fall apart during the 7 days of Sukkot. Miyad daininan le kiluhu yavesh. We instantly look at it as if it's dried out, and vehevi avir, and we already treat it as empty space. So somebody's putting up a sukkah on Erev Yom Tov, he realizes he doesn't have schach, he sees some kind of stalks, he says, I know I won't be able to use this for the whole Yom Tov, but right now I'm in a rush, I need a sukkah for tonight, for the mitzvah seder raisa of the first night of sukkah. I'll throw this up on the sukkah, I know it's going to dry out and fall apart, I'll replace it in the middle of sukkahs. No, that schach is pasul d'Rabbanan. It's a gzera, since it's not going to last for all 7 days, you're not allowed to use it even for 1 day. Upaisel b'shloisha, afilu min atzad, and it would pasul the sukkah, even if there's only a strip of it on the side between the wall and the schach, that's considered empty space, and it pasuls the sukkah. Sif Yud Gimel. Kol davar hamechuber ein mesachichin bay You're not allowed to use as schach anything that's mechuber lekarka. If it's attached to the ground, it's pasul for schach. V'dinoi kedin ha'ilon. Anything that's attached to the ground has the same din as the din of a tree. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Lamed Vav, hamechuber. Anything that's attached to the ground, pirush hamechuber me'ikaroi. It has to be something that from the outset is attached to the ground. Kegoin gefen udalas, like a grapevine or the vine of gourds. These are things that are mechuber lekarka. They grow from the ground. If you didn't detach it yet from the ground, it's mechuber lekarka. Even though it would be very easy to drape it over the sukkah, that's a problem because it's mechuber lekarka, and it's mechuber lekarka me'ikaroi. Originally, from its outset, it was mechuber lekarka. Aval, however, talush, something that was already removed from the ground, ulebesoif chibroi, and now you attached it to the ground. Kasav Beis Yosef v'Siman Tov Reish Chavav b'Shem Trumas Hadesh and the kosher. So let's say you had a grapevine and you ripped it out of the ground, and now you draped it over the sukkah, and now you want to stick the base of it back into the ground so that it should stay in place. That's not a pasul of mechuber. Now, if you stuck it back into the ground with enough time that it's actually going to take root again, then it would once again be a problem of mechuber. But if it's just a point that you stuck it into the ground, that does not generate a pasul of mechuber because it was already talush. You cannot use mechuber lekarka as schach. Ayin b'Siman Tov Reish Chavav Siv Beis. We already learned this previously in Siman Tov Reish Chavav. Le'inyanim avar v'sikech bahem. If you transgress this halacha and you did use mechuber for schach, so you had grapevines and they're attached to the ground, and you draped the grapevines over your sukkah, and you think you have beautiful schach, and then somebody reminds you of the halacha. Wait a second, it's mechuber lekarka. So now you want to take a saw and you want to cut it at ground level, and you'll say, all right, it's no longer mechuber. Is that okay? No, we already learned that that's pasul because of taseh v'lo mina asui. You have to make the schach bekashrus. When you put the schach up, it has to be kosher schach that you put up l'shem tzeil. When you took that grapevine and you draped it over the top of the sukkah, it wasn't kosher schach, it was pasul schach. Now, when you cut it at the bottom to make it kosher schach, it's too late. You put it up bipsul. So we learned in Tov Reish Chavav, what would you have to do? After you cut it at the base, you would have to pick it up on top of the sukkah. You would have to pick up each piece, pick it up, and put it down to Shem Tzeil. Now we go to Sif Yud Daled. Says the Mechaber. Yesh dvarim she'asru chachamim l'sachech behem lechatchila. There are items that the Chazal assered you to use for schach. You're not allowed to use these things for schach lechatchila. Lechatchila, initially you shouldn't use them. But in the case of a b'di'evet, if you did use them as schach, you're yoytze the mitzvah. What are these? Veheim mine asavim, different types of grasses. So grasses, really, midaraisa, they're perfectly usable for schach. They're tzemeach min ha'adama, they grow from the ground. If you already cut them off, so they're talush. They're not royal lekabel tumah, so really, these kinds of grasses are perfect schach. What's the problem with them? Why did the Chazal aser it? V'hei mine asavim, these are types of grasses, she'enam ru'uyim la'achila. They're not royal la'achila, so they're not a meichel, they're not mekabel tumah as a meichel. V'einam mekabel tumah, they're not mekabel tumah at all. V'reicham ra, however, they are malodorous, they have a bad odor. Oy shenoishrim aleihem, or there is something where the leaves or the pins and needles, whatever they have growing on them, are constantly falling off. And therefore the Chazal said, you cannot use this for schach lechatchila. Why? The chayshinon, because we are concerned, shema mitoy shareichan ra, either as a result of the bad odor, oisha aleihem noishrim, or because there's constantly stuff falling into the sukkah, yetze min hasukkah, we're afraid you're going to leave the sukkah. So to summarize this Sif Yud Daled, the Chazal said, if you have something that grows from the ground that really would be perfectly kosher as schach, It's not a Michael. It's not royal kabel tuma. You didn't make it into a keli. It's tzaimeach min adama. So it seems to check off all the check boxes for schach. But the problem is that it doesn't make good schach. It stinks. And if you go into the sukkah, there's going to be a very bad smell. Or it's something, let's say, I guess like dried out branches of a pine tree, where the needles are constantly falling into the sukkah. They're getting all over your food. They're getting all over you. So it's unpleasant. You don't want to eat there. Therefore, the Chazal said, L'chatchila, you should not use this as schach, because we're going to be concerned that it may drive you out of the sukkah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Islam Ches. The Chazal only answered these things l'chatchila. However, if you went ahead and you did use these things as schach, the sukkah is kosher. You could eat in the sukkah, and you would be yotzeh the mitzvah. V'hainu, not only that, even if you happen to have a beautiful pile of bamboo poles, if you already put this smelly stuff up as your schach, you're not chayiv to take it down and replace it with other schach. However, if whatever you put on top of the sukkah was so malodorous, that a person simply cannot tolerate it, yesh larma the pasul min HaTorah. Now your sukkah might be pasul midaraisa. Because let's remember, one of the requirements of the sukkah is it has to be royal ladira. Teshvu kein taduru. You have to be able to sit in your sukkah the way you live in your house. You're not going to live in your house if it stinks. You're going to go out of the house. So if you have a sukkah that pashut stinks and it's intolerable, that already could be a pasul midaraisa. Islamic test, another example the Mechaber gave, is when pieces of the schach are falling into the sukkah. Shenoishrim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'davka kishenoishrim tamid. This pasul, if only if things are constantly falling into the sukkah. If we're talking about a situation where it's only when the wind blows, then let's say some leaves fall into the sukkah, kshera, that doesn't pasul the sukkah. Sif Tezvav. V'chein. Now this v'chein we're going to see is a little bit of a funny v'chein. V'chein means similarly, so it sounds like the din of Sif Tezvav is identical to the din of Sif Yodalid. We're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah that it's not. What the Mechaber means over here when he says v'chein, in Sif Yodalid we were talking about schach, that's pasul mid'Rabbanan. In Sif Tezvav we're also going to discuss schach, that's pasul mid'Rabbanan. However, the Mishnah Berurah is going to point out there's a great difference between Sif Yodalid and Sif Tezvav. In Sif Yodalid, we said that the schach is pasul mid'Rabbanan only lechatchila, but b'di'eved the sukkah is kosher. Here in Sif Tezvav, we're going to speak about schach, which is pasul mid'Rabbanan, and it's pasul even b'di'eved. Says the Mechaber, v'chein asur l'sakech b'chavila. You're not allowed to use bundles of stalks as schach. Why? There were times that they would take reeds, they would take different types of stalks, they would tie them into the bundles, and they would throw them on top of a sukkah in order to dry them out in the sun. Now, I want you to imagine this. Let's say it's a week before Sukkot, and somebody is out in the field, and he's tying up these bundles of stalks that he wants to dry out. And he looks at the sukkah, and he says, great, the sukkah is positioned in the sun. I'll throw these bundles up on top of the sukkah to dry them out. And he goes and he throws them up there. Why did he throw them up? He threw them up liyavsha. He threw them up to dry them out. He did not put them up litzail. He didn't put them up for shelter inside the sukkah. Now, if he would go into that sukkah on Sukkot, that sukkah would be pasul, because that schach was not put up b'kashrus. That, in order for schach to be kosher, it has to be put up l'shem tzeil. This wasn't put up l'shem tzeil. Now, it looks like it checks off all the required boxes for schach. It's sameach ben adama, it's not royal lekabel tuma, it's not a meichel. It seems to be perfect. Somebody comes from the street and looks at the sukkah. It looks like a perfectly good sukkah, but it's not, because the schach was not put up l'shem sale. That's the problem here in this sif. Says the Mechaber again, v'chein. Similarly, we have another Isser D'Rabbanan. Also l'sakich b'chavila. The Chazal said that you cannot use bundles of stalks as schach. Why? Sometimes a person will use the sukkah as a good place to throw his bundles up in order to dry them out in the sun. And then when it gets closer to sukkahs, nimlach aleha l'shem sukkah. He looks at it and he says, wow, now I have a perfectly good sukkah. I don't have to break out the bamboo poles. These bundles are making perfectly good schach. But that's not true. V'oisa sukkah psula, this sukkah is a pasul sukkah, misham taseh v'loy mina asui bepisul. Because this is taseh v'loy mina asui. You have schach that was put up bepsul. You have schach that was not put up l'shem tseil. So when you put it up, it was pasul. Now you changed your mind and you want to use it for schach, but it's too late. It wasn't put up l'shem schach. And therefore, the gazra kol chavila atuzos. Because of this problem, the Chazal made a takana, and they said that you cannot use chavilos. You cannot use bundles, even if you're going to put them up l'shem tseil. We're not going to let you use them as a gzera. Maybe somebody's going to put them up liyavshan, and then change his mind and want to use it for schach, and that would be a pasul sukkah. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton mem. V'chein also l'sakech b'chavila. After ka'amar v'chein, even though the Mishnah Berurah begins this sif, even though the Mechaber begins this sif with the word v'chein, hainu, the only thing he means by the word v'chein is the keshem hahi in yana de sif yod daled asur chachamim, just like in sif yod daled. We were discussing in Isser D'Rabbanan, gam zeh asur chachamim. Here in Tesvav, we're also discussing in Isser D'Rabbanan. Aval, however, mikamakam hachachami riyoser. The halachah here in Tesvav is more chamer than the halachah in Yudalid. Ta'afilu b'di'eved aser. Because here in Sif Tesvav, if you put chavilos, if you put bundles on top of your sukkah, it's pasul even b'di'eved. V'loidami l'sif Yudalid. And in this way, it's not similar to Sif Yudalid. Tahanu, because in the cases of Sif Yudalid, with the smelly schach, or the schach where pins and needles are falling off, loipsili elamisham dilma shavik luhu v'nafik. Over there, the pasul is we're afraid you might be driven out of the sukkah. Aval chavila, but when it comes to the bundles, psula didahu mishum dechayshinan dilma avid sukkah mina asui. Over here in Tesvav, where we're asering chavilos, the reason the Chazal aser the chavilos is a gzera. They were really afraid you're going to end up making a pasul a sukkah of tasev v'loy mina asui. So this is a much more chamer dika d'Rabbanan. The D'Rabbanan in Yudalid it's a kosher sukkah. Just we're afraid you might get driven out of the sukkah. But the sukkah is always going to be a kosher sukkah. Here in Tesvav, we have a gzera. We're afraid if we let you use chavilos, your mamish can have a pasul sukkah tasev v'loy mina asui. So b'di'eved nami paslin on lei. Here in the halachah of Tesvav, the Chazal asked this sukkah even b'di'eved. Over Medina Isainu Shamaychim Agudai Sanfe Ilana Shekarin Yelnik. And the Chavetz Chaim says that in his regions they used to sell bundles of twigs and branches that were called yelnik. And the point of it was, people bought these bundles. They had earthen floors, so you always needed something to throw down on top of the earthen floor to make it neat and to dry up any moisture, give a nice surface to walk on. So apparently they had these bundles of twigs that you bought, you broke them open, and you scattered them on the floor. After the Indinam Kachavila, the Chavetz Chaim says perhaps this halacha doesn't apply. Came in the Derek Lahanichan Liyavshan. Because again, the whole point of this Isser is we're afraid people are going to throw these bundles on top of the sukkah to dry them out and then leave them there as schach. It wasn't put up for sale, it's tasav v'loy mina asui. But over here, no one's going to do this. The Adarabah, quite the opposite. These bundles of twigs, kisheyisyavshu ein shavin klum. When these dry out, they're not worth anything. People used them when they were moist, so there's no room for a concern that they're going to throw them up to dry them out. Ice cut mem aleph. The potential pasul of the sukkah here would be taseh v'loy mina asui bepisul. Chag sukkah is taselach You have to make a kosher sukkah. When you put the schach up, it has to be kosher. If you throw up bundles to dry them out, you didn't put it up l'shem tzeil. When you put it up, it wasn't kosher. Kevin shelo yinichad l'tzeil. Now let's go weiter here in Sif Tezvav. Continues the Mechaber. 1, 2, 3, 3 lines down into Sif Tezvav. V'kevon shemipnei zeh asaruhu, since this is the reason for the isser of the chavilos, because of the chash of tasev v'loy min asi b'pisel, loy hutzrichu lesar ela b'chavila shederech liyavsha. Therefore, says the Mechaber, and the Mishnah Berurah just alluded to this, the only point, this only applies when we're talking about bundles that somebody hypothetically would put up on top of his sukkah in order to dry it out, sholei l'shem tzeil. The Mechaber says this only applies to bundles that have at least 25 reeds in them. Therefore, any bundle that's comprised of less than 25 reeds or branches, you're allowed to use them as schach. This was the derech. The type of bundles that people would throw up on top of a surface to dry out in the sun always had at least 25 branches in them. So less than 25 branches, the gzera doesn't apply. Let's say you have a situation where you have 25 branches coming out of one root. Let's remember, we're talking about a natural item here. So let's say I'm imagining in my mind aravas. You know, when you plant aravas, you have a lot of branches coming out of one root. So let's say somebody uprooted a section of an arava bush, and there's 25 branches coming out of it. And now he goes ahead, says the Mechaber, Ukisharam beroisham hasheni. So at the base, all 25 are attached to the root. Now you go to the top, and you tie the top together. So now you have a neat bundle. It's together at the bottom, and it's tied together at the top. Eina nikreis chavila. That's not called a bundle. Kevin she'ikran echad. The only time we call something a bundle is when you took 25 disparate pieces and you tied them together. But this is not 25 disparate pieces. It's all attached at one common root. So that doesn't get the din of a bundle, and that would be kosher for schach. V'im agad imoim kone acher. But if you took a second root with multiple branches, let's say you broke off one piece of the bush that has 12 pieces coming off, and then you broke off another piece that has 13 pieces coming off, and now you want to tie the two of them together. Says the Mechaber, that already is called a chavila, and this halachah would apply. Hagah, the Ramah throws in another couple of caveats here. V'chol chavila she'ena keshura mishnei rasheha. Any bundle that's not tied on both sides, on top and on bottom, she'yecholin l'taltel lakach, so that it's very easy to transport it and carry it, ain't a chavila. That doesn't constitute a chavila. I think the logic over here is that in order for the gzera to apply, in order for us to have a valid concern that you might take the chavila, you might take the bundle and throw it up on top of the sukkah to dry it out, it has to be something that's very easily transportable and carryable. But if it's only tied on one end, ain't a chavila, that's not a bundle, and this gzera would not apply, and it would be mutter to use it for schach. Mishnah Berurah is cutting mem beis. Eina nikreis chavila. If all 25 pieces were attached at a common root and you just tied it together at the top end, that's not called a chavila. Ritzayne loymar, what he wants to say is it's not called a chavila, and therefore you're allowed to use it for schach even lechatchila, vein tzarich lahatir, and you don't have to cut it apart. Is cut mem gimel. The Ramah said it has to be tied b'shnei rasheha. It has to be tied on both ends, on top and on bottom, so that it's easily transportable. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'im kisharon be'emtza. If it was tied together at the middle, heavy eged. That does constitute a chavila, and then this halachah does apply, and you cannot use it for schach. Di'echoilin l'taltala, because if it's tied together at the middle, it's very easily carryable. Sif Tezayin. Chavila, a bundle, she'ein kosher ma'isa ela l'machram b'minyan. Let's say somebody wants to buy reeds, and reeds are sold in bundles of 25. Umiyad kishiyiknena akaina yatirena. But this is a type of bundle which people buy the reeds to use the reeds for different uses. But commonly what they do is they buy the bundle, they take it home, they cut it open, and now they use the individual pieces. Eina chavila, that doesn't get this halachah of a chavila. And again, the reason is because it's not the derech to take this and throw it up on top of a sukkah to dry it out. The derech of this kind of chavila is that you cut it open to use the individual reeds. Siv Yud Zayin. Im sikech b'chavila v'hitira. Let's say you went ahead and you did use a chavila for schach. Now let's remember what we said in Sif Tezvav. We said that this gzeira is very chamur. The chavila is also for schach even b'di'evet. So you went ahead and you took these bundles and you threw them up on top of your sukkah. And you put it up l'shem schach. You didn't put it up liyavsha. So it's 100% kosher midaraisa. You put it. You don't have a problem with tasav aloy min asui. You put it up l'shem tzeil. You put it up for schach. So there's absolutely no problem here midaraisa. But there is a problem midrabanan. We said you're not allowed to use a chavila, a gzeira, because you might put it up not l'shem tzeil, and it might be tasav aloy min asui. And we said this gzeira is very chomer, and it's even pasul b'di'evet. So it's Erev Sukkos. You took these chavilos, you put them up on your sukkah, l'shem schach, l'shem tzeil. Now your neighbor comes over and he says, I learned Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, you're not allowed to make schach out of chavilos. And you'll say back, what do you mean? What's the problem? I put it up l'shem tzeil. He's going to say, no, the Mishnah Berurah says even b'di'evet, this is a problem. It's a gzeira, because of a gzeira against the possibility of tasav aloy min asui. So you say, oh, okay, so you know what I'll do? I'll cut the bundles open. I'll cut them open, and now they're not chavilos anymore. So, says the Mechaber, Im sikech b'chavila, if you put these chavilos up on top of your sukkah, and you did it l'shem schach, l'shem tzeil, and then you realized you have a problem, v'hitira, so now you cut the bundles open, and you figure, okay, now I'm good. Kshera, the Mechaber says, indeed, this is kosher. Kevin she'eni surah eli mishum gzeira. Because the whole problem over here was only a gzeira, ought to a problem of tasav aloy min asui. Okay, you cut it open, now it's okay. Now, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah's cut mem daled. Kevan, the Mechaber said, why is this okay? Because the whole problem over here is only a gzeira. Ritzayna loymar, what the Mechaber wants to tell you over here is, he wants to point out to you that this halachah is very different than a different halachah that we learned back in Siman Tov Reish Chavav, and that we actually alluded to today. Let's go back to our original case of tasav aloy min asui. You have a grapevine growing in your backyard. You built your sukkah next to the grapevine. You take the vines of the grapevine and you drape them over the sukkah. Okay, when you put that schach up, you put it up pasul. It's mechubar l'karka, it's pasul. Tasav aloy min asui, it's pasul. Now you go to the bottom with a saw and you cut the grapevines off the ground, so they're no longer b'mechubar. The sukkah is still pasul. It's still tasav aloy min asui. What do you have to do to make the sukkah kosher? You have to go to the top of the sukkah, you have to lift the vines off, and you have to put them back l'shem tzeil. Until you do that, the sukkah is pasul. Now, how about if you take the saw and you cut the grapevines off the ground and you do that l'shem tzeil? Is that good enough? No. That's not enough of a maisa of putting the schach onto the sukkah l'shem tzeil. The schach was put up b'psul, and it's still there b'psul. The only way you can make it kosher is you have to actually lift up the vines and put them back down l'shem tzeil. You might have thought that this case of Siv Yod Zayin is exactly the same. I put up bundles of reeds on top of my sukkah, and I put them up l'shem tzeil, but it's pasul midrabanan, a gzeira otu tasav aloy min asui. Now I went ahead and I cut the bundles open. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe the same way it's not enough to cut the tree, to cut the grapevine at the base, it's not enough to take away the problem of tasav aloy min asui. Maybe cutting open the reeds, the bundles of reeds, is also not enough. Maybe I have to cut open the bundles, and then I have to lift up all the individual reeds and put them back down l'shem tzeil. Says the Mechaber, no. just cutting open the bundles is enough. Let's see inside. What the Mechaber wants to say here is, it's sufficient to just cut open the bundles. This is not similar to the case of the grapevine or the tree in Tafresh Chavav Siv Beis. Where if you cut the tree at the base, the tree that's over the sukkah to make it kosher, you want the branches of the tree to be schach. It's not good enough to just cut the tree at the base. You have to move all the branches and put them back down l'shem schach. The hakitzitza, the act of cutting the tree at the base, that's not enough of a significant maisa to render the schach l'shem tzeil and render it kosher. Maybe now we should say the same thing by cutting open the bundles of the reeds. Amar, to address this, the Mechaber says, the Shani Hacha She'en Isura Be'etzem. Over here, our case is different. In our case, the schach that you put up l'shem tzeil is not inherently pasul. It's inherently kosher. By the grapevine, when you draped the vines on top of the sukkah, when the grapevine was still mechubar l'karka, over there, the schach was inherently pasul a schach. It's mechubar l'karka. But over here, the schach is inherently kosher a schach. Because you put these bundles up on top of the sukkah, l'shem tzeil. Midaraisa, it's mamish perfect schach. Elimishum gzera, but because of gzera d'Rabbanan asaruha. But in Tafresh Chavav, when we're talking about the grapevine, over there the grapevine is pasul midaraisa because it's mechubar l'karka. But Yinan Maisa Gemura, over there we need a much more significant Maisa to render the sukkah kosher. We have to move the branches after we cut the tree. And for this reason, the Mechaber is going to end off Siv Yud Zayin here. We didn't read it yet, and he's going to say the Chavila Shehinicha Liyavsha. If you put the bundles of reeds up on top of the sukkah, not l'shem tzeil, if you actually put these bundles up liyavsha to dry them out, so that it's mamish pasul midaraisa, because you didn't put it up l'shem tzeil, dami mamish lahasam, then it is similar to the case of Tafresh Chavav, v'tzarch ninua achar HaTorah. If you put bundles of reeds on top of your sukkah, liyavsha, to dry them out, you didn't put them up l'shem tzeil, that's pasul midaraisa. Now it's tasav aloymin asui. Now it's not enough to just cut open the bundles of reeds and to do that l'shem tzeil. You have to cut them open and you have to lift up all the reeds and put them back down l'shem tzeil. You have to move them all out of their place. Let's just read the rest of Yud Zayin inside in the Mechaber. If you put the bundles of reeds on top of the sukkah to dry them out, and then you changed your mind and you want to use it for schach, now you're dealing with a psul midaraisa of tasav aloy min asui, a real tasav aloy min asui, not a gzeira otu tasav aloy min asui. Now it's not enough to just cut them open. Now, after you cut them open, you actually are going to have to move all of the reeds. Alright, I was overly optimistic. I thought we would get to go a little bit weiter. I see it wasn't to be. Alright, we'll continue with Sif Yud Ches tomorrow. In any case, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shalom should send Yeshua's, Refuas, and Parnasa to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Tzedek b'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.